Chapter 4 of Divers Women by Pansy and Mrs. C. M. Livingston. This recording is in the public domain. Sunday Fractures, Chapter 4. Some People Who Were False Friends. Did a woman ever start out, I wonder, with the spirit of turmoil and unrest about her, that she did not find helpers? Especially if she be one of a large congregation, she comes in contact with some heedless ones, some malicious ones, some who are led into mischief by their undisciplined tongues, some who have personal grievances. And there are always some people in every community who stand all ready to be led by the last brain with which they come in contact; or, if not that, they are sure to think exactly as Dr. Jones and Judge Tinker and Professor Bolus do, without reason as to why or wherefore. This class is very easily managed. A little care, a little judicious repetition of a sentence which fell from the doctor's or the judge's or the professor's lips, and which might have meant anything or nothing, by the slightest possible changes of emphasis, can be made to mean a little or a great deal. It wasn't slow work, either. Not half so slow as it would have been to attempt the building up of someone's reputation. By reason of the law of gravitation, the natural tendency is downward, so prevalent in human nature, and by reason of the intense delight which that wise and wily helper, Satan, has in a fuss of any sort. Do Mrs. Dr. Matthews the justice of understanding that she didn't in the least comprehend what she was about; that is, not the magnitude of it. She only knew that she had been stung, either by her conscience or else by Dr. Selmser. She chose to think it was Dr. Selmser, and she felt like repaying him for it. He should be made to understand that people wouldn't bear everything; that he must just learn to be a little more careful about what he said and did. Take heed what ye do, let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Yes, she heard the text, and was thinking of her party all the time. Did she think that certain things which occurred in her parlors on that evening were not in accordance with the text? Then did she think to blot out the text by showing her ability to stir up a commotion? What do such people think, anyway? There came a day when even Mrs. Dr. Matthews herself stood aghast over what had been done, and didn't more than half recognize her hand in the matter, so many helpers she had found: non-temperance men, men of antagonistic political views, men who winced at the narrowness of the line drawn by their pastor, a line that shut out the very breath of dishonesty from the true Church of Christ, men and women who were honest and earnest and petty, who were not called on enough, or bowed to enough, or consulted enough, or 10,000 other pettinesses, too small or too mean to be advanced as excuses, and so were hidden behind the general and vague one that, on the whole, Dr. Selmser didn't seem to draw. The young people thought him severe or solemn or something. His sermons were not just the thing, did not quite come up to the standard, whatever that may mean. So the ball grew so large that one day it rolled toward the parsonage in the shape of a letter, carefully phrased, conciliatory, soothing, meant to be, every confidence in his integrity and kindness of heart and good intentions, and every other virtue under the sun. But, well, the fact was, the young people did not feel quite satisfied, and they felt that, on the whole, by and by, toward spring perhaps, or when he had had time to look around him and determine what to do, a change would be for the best, both for himself and for the cause. Indeed, they were persuaded that he himself needed a change. His nervous system imperatively demanded it. Let me tell you what particular day that letter found its way to the parsonage. A rainy, dreary day in the early winter, when the ground had not deliberately frozen over and things generally settled down to good solid winter weather, but in that muddy, slushy, transition state of weather when nothing anywhere seems settled save clouds, dun and dreary, drooping low over a dreary earth. came when the minister was struggling hard with a nervous headache and sleeplessness and anxiety over a sick child; came when every nerve was drawn to its highest tension, and the slightest touch might snap the main cord. It didn't snap, however. He read that long, wise, carefully written, sympathetic letter through twice, without the outward movement of a muscle, only a flush of red rising to his forehead, and then receding, leaving him very pale. Then he called his wife. "Mattie, see here, have you time to read this? Wait, have you nerve for it? It will not help you. It is not good news, nor encouraging news, and it comes at a hard time. And yet I don't know. We can bear any news, can't we, now that Johnny is really better?" With this introduction she read the letter, and the keen, clear grey eye seemed to grow stronger as she read. "Well," she said, "it is not such very bad news, nothing at least but what you ministers ought to be used to. We can go. There is work in the world yet, I suppose." "Work in the Lord's vineyard, Mattie, for us, if he wants us. If not, why then there is rest." Shall I tell you about that breaking up? About how the ties of love and friendship and sympathy were severed? You do not think that the whole church spoke through that letter? Bless you, no. Even Mrs. Dr. Matthews cried about it, and said it was a perfect shame, and she didn't know what the officers meant. For her part, she thought they would never have such another pastor as Dr. Selmser, and I may as well tell you, in passing, that she did what she could do to cripple the usefulness of the next one by comparing him day and night, in season and out of season, with dear Dr. Selmser. There are worse people in the world than Mrs. Dr. Matthews. Did he stay all winter and look about him and decide what to do? You know better than that. He sent his resignation in the very next Sabbath. And some of those letter writers were hurt, and thought he had more Christian principle than that, and thought that ministers, of all men, should not be so hasty in their acts. It showed a bad spirit. They went home after that, Dr. Selmser and his wife, to her mother's home. So many people have her mother's home to go to. Blessed mothers! He was so glad to get to her. He needed change and rest, and the letter writers had spoken truthfully. Did he take cold in packing and travelling? Was he overworked? Were the seeds of the disease running riot in his system during that early fall? Were they helped along any by that letter? Who shall tell? We know this much. He took to his bed, and he was no longer pale or quiet. The flush of fever and the unrest of delirium were upon him. He rolled and tossed and muttered. And it was always of his work, of his cares, of his responsibilities, never of rest. And yet rest was coming to him on swift wing. The Lord of the vineyard knoweth when his reapers have need of soft, cool days of glory, to follow weeks of service. Rapidly they come to him. But the river must be crossed first, and first there must be a severing of earth ties, a breaking of cords stronger than life. Never mind, the King knows about this too. And it must be, and is, and shall be, well. The rest came, all that we on this side knew of it, a pulseless heart, a shrouded form, lips of ice, forehead of snow, hush and silence. Just the other side of the filmy veil which we call time, what was the appearance of it there? He knows, and has known these many years. And, thank God, the wife of his love knows now, but we do not. Eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither hath entered into the heart the things that are prepared for them. What said the elegant modern church, that during the process of this change was undergoing a candidating siege? Why, they met in decorous assemblage, and passed resolutions, and had them printed, and draped the pulpit in mourning, and sent a delegation of the church to the funeral, with knots of the finest crape streaming from their shoulders, and on the Sabbath following, The quartet choir sang the funeral dirge in such a way as to melt almost the entire audience to tears. And then they went home, some of them, and remarked that the candidate who occupied their pulpit that morning had an exceedingly awkward way of managing his handkerchief, and didn't give out notices well. They didn't believe he would draw the young people. Now, what of all this story of one Sabbath day? Is it overdrawn? Do you say there are no such people as have been described? I beg your pardon, there are. It is not a story. It is a truthful repetition of Sabbath conversations. Would that such Sabbath desecrations were rare. They are not. You will remember that out of a congregation of 500 I have not given you a description of a dozen people. The difficulty is that a dozen people can and do set in commotion large bodies of humanity, and bring about results of which they themselves do not dream. About that minister. If he sunk under such a common matter as having certain ones in a church disaffected with him, it shows a weak mind, do you say? He should have expected trials and disappointments and coldness and disaffection. The servant is not greater than his Lord. All true. He had preached that doctrine to himself for 20 years, and earnestly strove to live by it. I do not say that he sunk under the humiliation. Only, don't you remember the fable of the last straw that broke the camel's back? What I do say is, that he had borne hundreds and thousands of straws. Also, remember that it was the Lord who called him from work. Assuredly he did not call himself. I think the Master said, "Let him come. It is enough, and we need him here." Then what about the unfinished work that he left? What about the midnight prayer over that sermon, the wrestling for a sign of fruit? Was it in vain? There is fruit that you and I do not see oftentimes. Do you remember the young man, Dwight Brower, and the Sabbath afternoon communion that he had with himself? Not with himself alone. The world, the flesh, and the devil were in full strength before him. And not them only. The angel of the covenant was there beside him. There was a conflict. The world and the devil were vanquished. Dwight Brower's name was on the church roll, but his heart had been with the world. He came over that day, distinctly, firmly, strongly, to the Lord's side. He weighed the solemn words, "Take heed what ye do, let the fear of the Lord be upon you." They sounded to him as they never had before. He resolved then and there that they should mean to him what they never had before, that they should mean to him what they evidently did to his pastor. That was 20 years ago. There were modern churches even then. Dwight Brower had been a power in the land since then. Not one, but scores, aye hundreds, aye thousands of souls has the Lord given him as seals to his ministry, and he is working now. Once I visited where he preached. I heard a lady say to him, "That was a wonderful sermon that you gave us today. To begin with, it is a wonderful text. I never before realized that the Lord was actually watching all our ways." He turned toward her with a smile and said, "It was Dr. Selmser who preached today. He has been gone 20 years, and he is preaching yet." And I heard a voice saying unto me, Right, Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord, yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Does it seem to you a pity that he could not have known, could not have had one glimpse of the fruit of his work? How do you know what view of waving harvests being garnered in the Lord calls him to look down upon from the heights of Pisgah? When I awake with thy likeness, I shall be satisfied. Be sure the Lord has satisfied him. Meantime, that modern church is still very modern indeed, and at this present time its pulpit is vacant. They are candidating. End of chapter 4.